Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the April 2019 Fisdap Tips and Tricks webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that due to the volume of attendees, all lines have been muted. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please send them through the chat, and we will save a couple of minutes at the end to address them at the end of the webinar. Today's tips and tricks topic is setting goals and achieving them through Fisdap. Our host is David Page, director of the UCLA Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum and one of the founders of Fisdap. Before we get started today, our product manager, Shivani Manjal, would like to provide a quick Fisdap roadmap update. So Shivani, I will pass it off to you.
Thanks, Haley. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick update on the Fisdap roadmap. We did have a release last week, which included some enhancements, one of those being aligning the graduation requirements report more with Appendix G. So we've added 2 new impressions to one for cardiac and one for the neuro category in the impressions section of the report. We've also added a capstone date field in the account information, so in the user profile or student profile. Now there's a capstone date where you can input the date the student actually enters their capstone portion of their learning, and you can use this field now for any of the reports. It's available as a filter. You can use it to filter the reports on capstone date, or still use any other date that you did before. And you will see another enhancement that's currently with our developers, where we will start to tie this date with the Appendix G Table 1, where the capstone date field would actually be used to calculate that line item in Table 1 of Appendix G. On the couple of bugs side, we resolved an issue where the airway management skills weren't saving when you were setting them up in the columns 1 of Table 2 and 4. So we've resolved that issue, and there was one issue that or bug that got introduced with our last release, where the word test was being appended to the headers of the requirements report, the graduation requirements report. We've also corrected that as well. And in terms of what's up and coming in the next couple of releases, you will see a lot of changes to Appendix G, and I will be doing a blog post and an email out of all the upcoming Appendix G changes. In general, most of the reports were actually simplifying the requirements, and so you will see a lot of the patient encounters that happen in lab that are on a live human being will start to count as, for instance, and some of the other things that will be coming. But we will send you the details within a day or two over email, and we'll also do a blog post on the Fisdap website. So with that, Haley, I'll turn it back to you to get on with our webinar.
Thanks, Shivani. Dave, we'll pass it off to you.
All right, thank you. Well, once again, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and participate, and I do appreciate the continued involvement and invites. And for those that don't know me, I'm Dave Page, and as Haley has already introduced me, I was one of the people who helped start this, but I would love your feedback as a community, and we work together to make sure that things are working well. And so any kind of feedback that you give me or that you can give the system is much appreciated. So please keep the comments coming. I'm nursing a bit of a cold, so today if you hear me mute myself while I cough, no worries. And I want to remind everybody that we've put these tips and tricks webinar archives together so that you can go back or maybe assign it to one of your adjunct faculty members if they weren't able to participate in the webinar itself. Sometimes it's just helpful to be able to go back and say, exactly what did he say? And then I'm also human, so I'm likely to make lots of mistakes, and hope that while we're in the middle of this webinar, you will continue to send clarification questions, comments in the chat area, or questions so that this is useful to you. Otherwise, it's sort of a waste of time for everybody. And I definitely don't want to waste your time. So we're going to just review a little bit about goal setting. And I want to redirect everybody to the 2015 Paramedic Psychomotor Portfolio. So 2 places where educators are constantly looking for direction on exactly what students should do to graduate. And remind everybody that these documents are guides for us to set minimums, that the portfolio describes a period of skills, followed by individual discrete skills is what I'm going to call them, followed by scenarios, followed by more deeper, more meaningful, more realistic simulation, followed by a period of hospital clinicals, finally a field capstone event. And I'm also going to remind everybody that when we did the pilots, if we focus too much on individual skills at the beginning, this does not work very well. People end up trying to do all the skills in a lab at the beginning, which is impossible. You end up trying to repeat skills and do skills that you haven't even reached in the theoretical part of the curriculum. Let's say, for example, pediatric intubation. That's something that you would typically do with peds, and we do it late in the process. So, you know, birth, maybe some of the skills that are later in the program. If you try and front load all the quote unquote individual discrete skills, you're going to find that everything gets focused on skill-based education, when really the portfolio was intending for people to do scenarios right away, do many of them, and really transition people away from individual skill repetition and into integration of those skills within scenarios, which in Fisdap really has always meant the word scenario, the word simulation, replace it with the word patient. These are patients we're tracking. Finally, hospital and field clinicals, or field, the capstone internship is sort of at the end. And I think this continues to be a very useful figure in the portfolio. This is a critical piece to understanding the ebb and flow to paramedic programs and how we often are doing a lab or a clinical at the same time. If students are starting to go to a phlebotomy lab, or maybe they go to a CCU to look at an EKG monitor for a while, or they go to an ER to learn how to do initial assessments, while they're still finishing some of the pieces to the theoretical or quote unquote didactic or laboratory phase. So it's not as clean as one would want in terms of this, then that, then that. Very few programs can achieve that, especially when you've got everybody going to field or hospital at the same time. It's the scheduling issue. So I do want to remind everybody that the field experience in the EMS unit can start early. It's helpful, I think, to expose students to that environment if they've never been out there before, and that marking the moment of the capstone is actually quite important, so that at the final moment, which is really what we care about in terms of accreditation, we know that the student put it all together and they were able to lead a call. So this is, I think, critical to understand when we're setting goals for students and for programs. When it comes time for a site visit, a lot of people are confused about, you know, how many of each things to count, quote unquote, and what is expected. And so there's been a lot of hype around that, particularly with the release of Appendix G. I just want to remind everybody that the recommendations that are in here are really goals that are approved by the program director, the instructors, the medical director, the advisory committee, and that hopefully you're doing a little bit of research to figure out what is realistic in your program, but that setting goals, for example, of 0 would probably not be very conducive to your students graduating and taking good care of patients. And that just because the COA set a goal of 2 as a minimum, that that did not mean that it was the ideal goal. It was just a threshold for we are not comfortable with less than 2, and we can't require any more because we don't know if programs can actually achieve that. And in looking at all the data to see if programs could achieve them or not, setting appropriate goals is really what it's all about. And appropriate to your location may mean that in your system, students will achieve 30 intubations, and in another system they might not be able to get intubation in a live OR, for example. So doing cadaver intubations or high fidelity simulation may be the only solution. I think that's important because there's been a kind of a runaway train with these concepts that 2 means 2, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. 2 is, I guess, a minimum where most reasonable people would say you probably shouldn't graduate paramedic school without doing this a couple of times, or at least assessing a child twice. That would be insanely low, but it's at least that. So let's do a step-by-step kind of review of how to set goals in Fisdap, and I want to start with the concept of graduation goals. And this is the original concept around what we were trying to do with Fisdap, a community focused on trying to track things together and then report it together so we could help give feedback about what realistic goals would be nationwide and guidelines for our programs. And that continues to be a goal for us. I also want to make sure we are differentiating between what a graduation goal would be, as in a summative, you're finished, you're now ready to go take care of patients in the field, versus goals that are set as milestones within a program. And I think it's really great to set milestones. Showing progress towards goals, showing incremental progress is ideal. It's something that during a site visit, the COA site visitors might actually really be looking for, is for you to show how progression is working. But in the concept of the summative goal here, I think it's important to know kind of where, this is again a tips and tricks, so it's kind of what are the shortcuts that you can take in Fisdap to get to the places that you need to go. So please speak up if you have a shortcut that you like. I like going to the reports page, hitting the graduation requirements report. That seems to be an intuitive name for this, are you finished? And if you click on that, you'll end up setting the parameters for your report. So this is where Shivani was saying, you can limit it by date, but let's start with limiting it by goal set. And you can have different goal sets. So semester 1, perhaps EMT class. We at UCLA are limiting it by class because we have decades of tracking with Fisdap. So there's students that have the class of 59 or earlier had one goal set. Now class 61 may have a different goal set, and we can also set it if we wanted to. If we're, say for example, in a semester type environment, you could set the semester 1 goals, or be much more specific for EMT class goals, first semester, fall semester, etc. So these are customizable titles, but they should be intuitive to the students so that we don't have a confusion about what is my goal set. And we'll show you where the widget comes into place here in a minute. Under the next select shift information, this is a critical setting that most people forget to look at. And I particularly like knowing if the students that I'm supervising are meeting their goals by seeing real patients in hospital and field, or if we're getting them from labs. So it's an ideal situation where you can say, you know what, I only want to see field and hospital, or I want to see all 3, and I want to limit it to just, what has been going on in the last week, the last semester, or in the capstone. So I just want to look at the capstone field internship and limit it to that. Or I want to see the entire educational record of a student from beginning to end. With these goal sets, I'm going to focus a little bit more on those because that's really what we came to talk about. I want to keep reminding everybody that Fisdap was founded on a very simple concept: track the patients you see. So when we start tracking individual skills and don't enter patient information, and we start using Fisdap for other things than just, I saw this patient, this is what I did when I was taking care of the patient, some of the reports will not only give you partial pictures, and that's when we get into trouble because people say, oh, there's a lot of reports, I get confused. And I'm going to go back to the simple, keep it stupid, simple, KISS principle. And in the end, when your preceptor, when you go on a call or a simulation and your preceptor says, yep, you're good, then that goes right into your record as a patient. Which means that if a student is entering lab shifts and they are not entering patients, maybe they're entering lab practice items, or they're attaching a handwritten form, or they're filling out a site evaluation, none of that is going to show up completely in a graduation goal. Now, you can pair lab practice items. For example, if there's an IV done on a human and it's in a lab practice, you can tie it so that it will appear as a skill in the graduation report. That is possible for skills only. But as you can imagine, we are very interested in humans, not just skills. So our customizable goal set for graduation, which again, you can put any title here that you wish, you want to be very clear about the kinds of humans that these students are going to interact with or simulate interactions with. And over the years, there's been lots and lots of controversy, many calls to Fisdap about, what is a child? I do love this because the folks at Fisdap really just try to create software that works for us. But if you ask 10 educators what's a child, apparently we can't decide when we can't agree. So it's funny that we want Fisdap to define it, but in fact, when you look at COA or AHA, we have a hard time deciding if that's, if the infant starts at 1 month, the toddler starts at 1 year, and angry posts on social media and an email because somehow these are not counting like they're supposed to. Well, I'm always laughing about what's supposed to be accurate and what is, real in terms of how we see Fisdap react to the environment. So that's a sidebar for me, but it's clear that you have control over who is what in this report. And in other reports, it might be fixed. You might just say, this is what the settings should be for all my other reports. But in this one, you can customize it so that you can decide what you think is a child and what you think is an adult. I think the other very interesting element, I've had many discussions over the years about why a team lead should only count if the student has done both the interview and the physical exam. This was actually, Bill Brown is a big advocate for saying you have to be in charge of both in order to actually successfully team lead. I'm not convinced 100% that that's even possible for you to be doing the entire interview and the entire physical exam. People are constantly listening to lung sounds, checking vital signs for you. You're getting information from the family that a partner picked up on. So you need to be in charge of it, not necessarily performing it. But our language is such that it says perform, and so over the years we've had many disagreements about whether or not that the student could just say, I was a team leader. Somebody else was doing the interview, but I was in charge. And this is the place where, in terms of Fisdap, we have allowed people to say, look, in my shop, this is what we call a team lead. And then the classic here is that in the hospital clinicals, there's no way to team lead. The team lead is really a concept of, both simulation and field, because you're simulating field conditions. So comprehensive assessments is what the old curriculum and the old DOT goals were all about. So most people set their goal sets to just be interview and exam, because if you're in the hospital, that's the only thing you're going to be able to get in order to say, I did a comprehensive assessment. Now, obviously, you're going to make decisions based on what's best for you, and you can clearly make some decisions that are based on, can I run a graduation goal that's only based on simulation, so that I can just see how my simulations are going in lab. And I think that's a powerful tool, but you do have to decide, I have one report, one goal set that says simulation goal requirement, and then maybe another one that says a hospital patient assessment requirement, if you're trying to help the students set goals for what they're going to do in the hospital. I think it's kind of overwhelming to just say you're going to see 400 patients or do these 400 assessments when you first start paramedic school. So breaking it down into digestible, simple to understand chunks might be, I think, a very useful thing. And again, please, speak up if you have questions, and give additional tips and tricks in the chat area if you wish. So once you've set this parameter for the repetitions of the kinds of ages, you then have some choices, which is where Shivani was mentioning, where we've expanded a little bit to start to look into some of the nomenclature used in Appendix G. So the tracking of the patient remains the same. There's all sorts of complaints that the patient may have, but there's only really two impressions that we, the educators, wanted Fisdap to allow per patient. And in the portfolio, we've mixed and matched some of these. I was part of those meetings, so I fully objected to this, but we still need to get consensus. And so sometimes, when it comes to chest pain, for example, chest pain may be traumatic or cardiac, but the concept that you're assessing a patient with that differential, abdominal pain is another one, that was part of the concept of the portfolio, that you're probably accounting for any cause of chest pain when the patient's complaining of it, because you're assessing for it. So complaint-based assessment was part of that concept. And here in the report, you're going to get counts for if a patient was dizzy, had abdominal pain, chest pain, and unaltered mental status. It doesn't matter how many complaints the patient has. The student is just taught to document all of them and that they'll show up. And that may be very different than the number of patient counts. So that's a key thing to remember, is that complaints do not equal patients. Patients have multiple complaints. I think it's also useful to have hours here, and of course the impressions underneath. Sometimes, as you can see on the settings on this that I mocked up for this webinar, you can see that you could click Team Lead up above on complaints, but not click on it on impressions, and then all of a sudden be stuck on, well, some of my leads appear to be counting, but some don't, and then the typical instructors who tell the students, don't document what really happened, just always put interview and exam, otherwise it won't count in Fisdap. Well, that's their own decision about, falsified documentation, because otherwise it won't show up on the report. I think it's best, really best, if we tell students to document what really happened and set realistic goals, because we want clinicians who don't lie on their EPCRs just because they want to make sure that their QI reports show up properly. So here is where an instructor has to decide, this, I do care about that they do the interview and the exam, but then I'm going to explain to them that they have to be mostly in charge of it. They don't have to perform every step of it. Or I really need them to say, I was a team leader, and we'll look at that here in a second, in order to make sure that we have 100% confirmation they were mostly in charge of the patient. And that's how we can determine whether they get credit for that or not. I think it's also helpful to just look at progress towards goals. And so when it comes to students who have a semester goal for certain hours, you can certainly enter that here. But I'm very much a performance-based evaluation kind of guy, so I'd be more inclined to know what kinds of patients they saw, so they don't just go to the ER and hide in the back room and eat donuts and don't talk to anybody. I also wanted to point out zeros here, which would be grossly negligent and inappropriate, and know that because the reports just got retooled, that these new cardiac, umbrella term for any impressions that have to do with cardiac, or any impressions that have to do with neuro, these are now defaulting to 0. And I think key for you to go in and reset, and of course I would put cardiac arrest at 0 unless I was creating a goal set that was including simulation, in which case Appendix G would absolutely want us to do simulations on patients that are pulseless and not breathing, and then be very clear about which goal set the student is to run to know if they've completed the goals that you wanted in lab. So moving on here to some of the finer details, I just wanted to again correlate here the fact that patients have multiple complaints, that does not mean we have to still treat them based on our differential and our impression, but that students can click on as many of these as are appropriate. When you look at the scenario lab forms in the portfolio, these scenario categories are a mixture of complaint, like chest pain, and condition or impression, like OB or seizure. So it's often people are saying, well, why isn't seizure a complaint? Well, patients don't say, generally, it's an impression. That's part of the differential. So where it has to do with dizziness and pain, etc., you're looking for a statement from the patient, and that's why these are mixed, and mapping them into the Fisdap complaints and impressions is something that you don't want your students to have to do. So this is very complex. I hate it. It's horrible. So instead of telling your students, well, if you click on this, you'll get credit for that, I would say, please just tell them, just document what you saw. And we're going to go back to a very simple KISS principle, and document what you see, and then we will make sure that you get a variety of lab patients so that you can meet your goals. All right. Okay. In the end, the graduation requirements report, once you run it, is extremely helpful because you can see anomalous students. So somebody who's just showing up as extremely strangely low, for example, I've highlighted some things that either in a site visit or as a clinical coordinator, I might look at and go, what happened here? Most of my students are 100%. Their columns are green, meaning that they met the goal that I set for them and that was approved by my medical director and my advisory committee and the rest of the faculty, and that was realistic. And then this one is not. So is this someone who I've sent away and actually failed, or is it somebody who's struggling, who's going to get extended? But you want to see that everything is green in order for them to graduate. And here I find very helpful the O column, which is observed, versus the P column, which is performed. students generally don't document. You can see all the zeros, don't document what they observed because they think that they don't get credit for that. And I think that's an error. I think we learn by observing first and then by doing. But in general, you can see opportunity here. So if you're looking at obstetrics and there was opportunity because they observed 5 and then they performed 5, it's a 50-50. They took advantage of it. And I always am skeptical of, I performed every single thing that I saw, and it just doesn't, this is a student who's clearly got a red flag, and we're going to have to go back and really look at their paperwork, interview them, see what's going on, versus a student who maybe didn't get lucky in their OB clinical, like this line here, and they only got 3 patients, but needs to maybe go back and redo that or do some simulation to compensate. Finally, in the goal setting here, we have the very traditional how many IVs, meds, ventilations, and the airway management goal. So all sorts of things can count for the airway management goal. You're going to attach those or create that that relationship in the lab skills, and we're going to watch or go look at that here in a second. And at the bottom of the graduation report are team leads, which again, you can set to a specific numeric value, or better yet, go with a new concept of 18 out of 20, which is a Eureka graph, and go run a Eureka graph in a separate part of Fisdap, which I'll show you here in a minute. So this to me is not useful because it does not give you that Eureka graph. It's a leftover from the old days. So the students are going to see their progress on dashboards, and I thought it'd be important to just quick say, careful. These dashboards get confusing if you don't really know your way around them, and students, in fact, programs have started to use them as if they were graduation requirements. So be careful, because this could be a semester goal. This could be a goal for EMT that's showing up, and the student is going off of the wrong goals. And then you can see at the bottom it says view the full graduation report. So you're taken to a complete view of this, not just what shows up on the widget. But this previous next issue has been the bane of our existence, because the students don't know that this is a multiple view widget. So you're going to be able to see, your airway management goal, your lab goals, and in this case, your graduation goals, which if you click on the little settings button, wheel, widget thing, bobber, you will be able to change the goal set for this widget. So you're in semester 1, you want to see semester 1, you change it and just look at semester 1 and then know what your goals are for that lab or that particular event. So it's a very important configuration setting, because I think everybody wants to fit everything into one report, but let's face it, this is a much more complex situation. So I'm getting a question here, and thank you for bringing these up. So how do we know that what complaints will count in the complaints section? I was under the assumption that they all counted. For example, the patient had chest pain, shortness of breath, headache. So absolutely, they all count. So thank you for the question. It's again a very good one. You're going to ask. I'm going to back up a second and go back to this concept of we're reporting what patients they saw. And so what I'm saying is that the report is keyed to give you these. It doesn't mean that they didn't see them. It just means that they won't appear in this report. This is a common issue with Fisdap. People think that the computer swallowed their paper, and that that the dog ate their homework, and that they won't be able to see their goals. So for the moment, if I were you, I would set goals that have to do with the ones they can see on this report. Now, in the future, maybe we can have more definition to these grad reports, but at least for now, these are sort of the things they'll be able to see in the graduation report. and therefore setting a goal for the number of patients that have a, I don't know, that have dizziness. Sorry, the dizziness is here. There may be a complaint, and I'll go back to the list of complaints that may not appear here. So I'm just going to go choking, for example. Fever is another example. These were not necessarily goals that were set by the COE or by the portfolio, but it's educators saying we want to make sure that we can keep track of these. So put these things in here. They just don't appear in the graduation goal. And so then the next question was about making specific goals for tracking medication, specific medications. And the answer is, overall, in the scheme of national standards, nobody has said you have to give this much of this kind of med. But if you wanted to look at a specific list of meds that were given, you absolutely can do that in a specific skills report. So there's a different report that will give you every single med they ever gave, and in that report, or in the skill finder report, you would be able to see that. And I'm just going to bring that up since you brought it up, and I love questions. You can go to reports, hit reports. You'll be able to go to the skill finder, and in the skill finder, and if I'm just going to do this live, even though I'm always skeptical of doing this in the middle of the webinar, skills finder, and you can say, I just want to look at the meds that somebody gave, get all the students in there, or just one student if you want to just focus on one, and then that report will give you all of the meds they gave and how they gave them. So not ideal for setting graduation goals, but it is one way in which you can see, did everybody give amiodarone, for example. So let me keep going with these dashboards, because I think it's important to finish up on that concept. People don't tend to remember there's a little arrow here that gives you detail. So that's another little issue. And then there's the constant observed, performed, and who, whether or not you actually got it done. So I think the other key message is that individual skills, like what we do when we do discrete skills on a check sheet that's done just in isolation, Fisdap keeps track of those in an eval, and that, as you know, is a very powerful tool that can put in all sorts of things, but with great power comes great responsibility. It's a different filing cabinet in Fisdap. It does not keep track of complaints, etc., in the graduation report, and you need to run a specific report that's just on evals in order to see the skill sheets and whether or not there's passed or failed, confirmed, etc. So I need people to remember that as we describe what the lab goals are. And in the lab goals, we're going to set some very specific parameters for what's going to happen or what we want in lab. Here in the settings, we're going to come in and say manage goal sets. And this is where, oops, sorry, it jumped forward for me. But here's where you can see that in the graduation requirements, you can tell it in the goals and in the widget, please use these parameters. So if you're only wanting lab shifts to count, only wanting clinical shifts to count, only wanting field or any combination, you're going to tell it just draw from here. And the same for these mannequin versus human. So a lot of times, if we're practicing simulations in lab to meet Appendix G, people get very confused about why things are not showing up in the graduation report. And it's best if you really, tune this up and either show everything or decide no animals count, but everything else is gonna work. Last but not least, I want to remind everybody that when we're entering patients in any field, a field or lab shift, the student, by clicking I was the team leader, is actually doing something very important. You can see here formative scenario versus summative scenarios matters, and so we want to hear that students were in a summative mode or in a just individual what we would call an individual scenario. So one-trick ponies, like the patient just has chest pain. They're not also a diabetic who crashed their car, they just have chest pain. So that'd be an example of a simple formative scenario. When we start to synthesize, combine, if you think of Bloom's taxonomy, and think of terminal objectives, or more in the summative kind of terminal scenario realm. So the fact that they say I was a team leader, they can even fill out an extra eval form if they wish. It could be a portfolio eval, it could be a separate eval that gives them a lot more detail as to why they passed it. But they shouldn't be checking this box unless they actually really mean, and this is a big caution, that I was the successful team leader. So the terminology here needs to be very clear, and that's a key to success, is to know that you can't just say I was a team leader if I really didn't succeed. In the future, we can dream of having great tools that say I was, pass, fail, what needs to, improve, etc. But for now, students really need to be coached. Don't click on that unless you were successful. And if you were unsuccessful, go ahead and fill out an eval sheet, and we're going to give you feedback, and we're going to do good education. But don't necessarily assume that just because you were in the room when a team lead was occurring, that you are going to get credit. So in the how to record team leads concept, a very key piece of this, again, I feel like we have to continually make this simple for the students. So it's just one is an affirmation. You enter a patient, you say I was a team leader. 2, you can enter an eval, which is great for skill sheets and more additional, deeper feedback. It's not the kind of thing that I would expect preceptors to fill out. It's the kind of thing that instructors would fill out in a lab, but or a student might self-evaluate in the field, but we're not going to get the detail there. But in the preceptor sign-off, and I would encourage you to use this both in labs and in the field, this preceptor sign-off gives you a very nice, very clear, the preceptor thinks this, I think this, here's the preceptor signing off, here's a plan of action for remediation, and this named preceptor sign-off is actually an eval that matches exactly what the National Registry sheet is. So it meets portfolio, it meets COE standards, it really fits everything, including professional behavior and affect. So you have a all-in-one tool that also gives you the Eureka graphs that you need to say, are you finished or you not? And again, reminder that this is the form from the registry, and how these categories, although they're laid out left to right here instead of top to bottom, the student self-evaluates, the preceptor puts in their ratings or agrees to it, and then initials it, and that's how we know that we've done all of the elements of a lead, if you will, or being in charge of it. So preceptor sign-off to me is the latest and greatest tool, and if you are going to do just the simplest form of I was or wasn't, and track only was or wasn't, then you would just do this affirmation checkbox. And if you want to do the soup to nuts, absolutely, completely super detailed, then you'd be in the fill out an eval form for every one of them. But I think this might be overkill, and we want to be careful not to tie these lab skills back to the the report because we don't want to have inaccurate counts. And what do I mean by that? So let me quick show you on the settings when we're in the lab skill settings. So here's if we go back to skills tracker settings and we click on the lab skill settings, we're going to tie individual skill sheets, if you will. These are lab practice items, and you're going to attach them to a skill that may actually appear in your graduation report. So if I, for example, put in whether it's an IV or say, for example, an endotracheal intubation, then it will tie back to a skill that's going to show up in the graduation report. And that means that we need to be very conscious of what is on the skill sheets, what we're giving students credit for, but then also whether or not in this peer-to-peer checkoff, people are just spinning, doing, repeat, and not necessarily truly managing an airway. They're just, sliding a tube in and out of the vocal cords, and that's somehow 1 intubation, 2 intubation, 3 intubation. So I'd say, I was watching a skill lab yesterday. The student put in the endotracheal tube upside down. I'm not kidding you. And they had their instead of using their left hand to sweep, they were using their right hand and crossing their hands. And the preceptor and the student that was watching gave him credit for that. And I thought, this is just garbage in, garbage out. Of course, it's going to tick the boxes, but this person is going to actually hurt somebody if they're actually in the field. So I'd be very, very careful about how these labs are supervised and making sure that these are confirmed skills if they're going to go into your graduation, and that students get used to, perfect practice means perfect performance, and practice just means permanence. So that's a Vince Lombardi quote. And remember that you don't have to tie things to anything in another report. It can just be a trauma assessment. You can just say you need to do these trauma assessments because we want to see you complete that in isolation. Again, these are lab skill settings. So these are lab practice items. And there's a lot of confusion here. These are not tracked as per patient. This is all this separate file cabinet. And occasionally we've been able to tie to some of the skills, but not the complaints. So trauma patient here does not necessarily translate to I assessed a trauma patient in the graduation goal. And I will take you back to when the student is filling out their information, guide them to enter patients when they're doing simulations or scenarios that give them credit for what Appendix G is asking for, which is more scenarios, more scenarios, more scenarios. It's really, really tough when I watch and see people just looping in all these lab practice items and entering a ton of these trauma adult physical exams when it just doesn't count. It's like, again, we're getting away from memorize the skill sheet and into how do you integrate these skills like the integrated out-of-hospital scenario was meant to do, and like Appendix G is asking people to do. Get it done once in here, that's fine. Get it done twice, watch the instructor go, you got the principle, now get it into a patient, and now you're cooking with gas, and it'll populate the right graduation reports. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to come back to my slides here just to say it's super helpful when you're very clear with the students about what graduation means. One very useful component to the entire reporting structure to know if somebody actually is getting to the meat of what is required to graduate is the portfolio part of Fisdap, which a lot of people don't even know about. So if you click on My Fisdap, one of the things you can click on is the student portfolio. And here you have a list of lab practice items, it is jumping forward for me, but lab practice items, so you can see these individual isolated skills, but know that you can go to some of these other evaluations to see in much more detail the kinds of patients that they've been doing scenarios or simulations for, and that here you can see exam results. You can see it if they're doing some practice tests on study skills, and if you're using the compliance module, they've met their OSHA or CPR or other requirements before they go to clinicals, their HIPAA training, other things that you might deem to be important, physical agility test, or whatever other concepts you've got. I think that covers the My Fisdap piece and goal settings. I'm just going to check in again with the questions to make sure that this was helpful. And I really appreciate all your comments online. I obviously, I'm a teacher. I like knowing that the thing that we're covering is actually meeting your needs. So thank you for entering those positive comments, and know also that I'm really open to hearing what could improve, or areas, the topics that we think maybe need to get covered. There's a lot of smart people on this webinar that all are going, well, it's the end of the semester. I'd really like to be able to get a sense of where my students are at, and if this didn't meet your needs, I'm certainly open, and I think everybody at Fisdap is open to it. If I can give you any tips of advice overall, is call the instructor hotline. Ben, Tashi, and Flavia, who are actually all listening to this webinar and sending me texts to make sure I don't trip and fall and say something stupid. So thank you to you guys. Are always willing to help people kind of figure out where they can put these goals and which reports it will show up in, so that you can do the best you can to again, keep it simple for the students. So please send us feedback, but I see one question. So does Fisdap track, and let me just bring it up in my window so I can read it. Does Fisdap track skill competency over time? Is it only via Eureka graphs, or is there another mechanism? So that's a great question, and deep, actually, in the amount of time we have. Maybe we should do an entire webinar on competency, because that's what I'm trying to do a doctorate on. The expectation from the COA and most educators is that you are sort of progressing, right? You start with individual skills, then you progress to scenarios, and you are doing it on live humans, and you are initially probably not very good at it, and then your preceptor's signing you off that you've led the call. And so that is one type of skill competency, quote unquote. The trouble is competence and competency are often mixed together, and so people say the word competencies when they mean individual discrete skills, but they also I think mean an overall sense of ability. Like, how many times should I demonstrate that I am able? And what the portfolio tried to do is take a view of competency as would be something that requires less and less prompting on the part of the preceptor, which Bruce Nippon and Barry Eberly put in their field training book long ago. This concept that if you can watch the student just do their thing, that's a competent student. So this is a matter of repetition, variety. It's not just about one kind of patient, but multiple. And the Eureka graphs help us track these leadership concepts over a concept of both your assessment, your individual skills, your ability to lead and direct others in a team, and maybe even be nice and be professional. And so we're looking at those graphs over time to see if the repetitions make for a fully competent individual. Unfortunately, a lot of people concept of this quote unquote skill competency is repetition of, something like sitting across from an instructor in a table and just, repeatedly putting on a splint until somebody says, oh, okay, now you know what you're doing. And we know from all the research we did with the portfolio that even though you can be very good at individual skills, when you put them in the context of a scenario, people get distracted. They're just unable to actually perform. So I'd say very complex concept here of how we think of evolution or the progression, and that it can be both progressive in terms of the kinds of exercises the students are doing, again, individual skills versus scenarios versus live humans in hospital and eventually lab or field, or it can also include the difficulty of the patient. So if you start to look at the kinds of leads the students have had and see more and more ALS leads as the student progresses into getting ready for their capstone, eventually leading all calls, ALS, BLS, and critical patients or not, that's the ideal. Debatable as to whether the preceptors really truly let the students be completely in charge of critical patients. But that is the goal of the capstone, is for them to really take on the role of, I'm ready to graduate and ready to go out there and do this by myself, or not by myself, but with another team member like an EMT who's not necessarily prepared for it. So I hope that answers that final question, and I think I'm out of time, but really appreciate the comments, and keep them coming, and I'm glad to see so many people are on the line, and again, thank you for your positive feedback. So keep those coming, and please reach out and use the instructor hotline to get directly into the help you need.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. A short survey will appear once we end the webinar. We would greatly appreciate your feedback and suggestions for future tips and tricks topics, and we look forward to seeing you next month.